Hello. All right. We're going to be continuing the 30-part series on Abolition for the People, a series of essays organized by Kaepernick Publishing. This one is called Resistance is in Our Blood. It's by Dr. Ameer Hasan Loggins, a Ph.D. Loggins has done some interesting research actually into reality television and how it affects the perceptions of African Americans outside the media. So and he's also teaching at UC Berkeley, I think. But yeah, I'm gonna try to dig up some of his writings to link into the Discord. He's got some pretty interesting studies. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into it. Resistance is in our blood. Before I get going, actually, these are intended as kind of a discussion format. I do read it, but I also encourage, chiming in with thoughts, and I interject with my own thoughts as we go along. So, feel free to chime in anytime if a point needs further discussion, or if you just want to comment anything. It's just... We're all living in a future created by slavery, by Ameer Hasan Loggins, Ph.D. When I was 19 years old, I was arrested. Instead of a dungeon, I was held in an overcrowded holding cell. Instead of being shackled and transported across the ocean on a floating prison, I was handcuffed, sitting shoulder to shoulder with another young black male, being hauled across the country on a prison bus. During intake, I was stripped of my clothes, forced to stand naked, as officers stripped me of both my pride and my dignity. I tried to cover my genitals. It was my last grasp at holding on to my humanity. I was commanded by officers to remove my hands. They had guns, and I had nothing. I complied. The officer barked, "Lift up your nutsack." I had no choice. I was ordered to squat down and cough. When I was finally handed a pair of state-issued boxer shorts, I was so desperate to have on anything to cover my exposed body that I did not give a damn that the underwear had been passed down, circulated among others who had been stripped naked before me. Author and scholar Saidiya Hartman once wrote, "I too live in the time of slavery, by which I mean that I am living in the future created by it. It is the ongoing crisis of citizenship. I echo her pain as I think about it, and live through the ongoing crisis of carcerality and those affected most by its existence. I think about African diaspora. I think about my family. I think about myself. In the summer of 2017, I visited the continent of Africa. While there, I basked in the beauty of the lovely Ramadan nights in Morocco. I stood in the searing sun of Egypt. I took pictures with the Great Pyramids as my backdrop. Hey, ghost. Mimicking Malcolm X during his visit in 1964. When I made it to Ghana, I visited the final resting place of Kwame Nkrumah. While standing at his tomb, I thought about Nkrumah writing, "All people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America." I guess you're not really here to talk about things. Bye. All African people, all people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or in any other part of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation. I stood there thinking about the divide between being identified as African and being of African descent. I was in the homeland of my ancestors, and yet I knew none of their names or faces. But I did know why they were forced to leave. I had reached a point where I could not return home to the United States without experiencing the carceral castles on Ghana's Gold Coast. I'm going to pause there. He paints the picture well of that loss of identity. And that's something that we've talked about here a few times, of knowing technically where you came from, but losing that connection to it. And that is something that imperialist methods and cultural genocide that America is still engaged in has inflicted upon blacks and indigenous people and even Latin populations here. There's a very concerted effort to inflict whiteness on everyone and make that, even if it's impossible to change the color of someone's skin, to erase their culture, their ancestry, anything about where they came from. It flies in contrast with the idea of like a melting pot, which embraces these people of different walks of life as equal partners in a society. And I always found the concept of the melting pot of different people bringing different perspectives and ideas to the table. I like that better than this idea of homogeny, that there's one way to live, that there's one way to speak, etc. Hello, dead man. It's something that, most white people can never actually really connect with, this notion of absolutely losing all connection with where you came from and who your ancestors really were. So, but yeah, continuing on. My feet were firmly planted, fixed to the weather-beaten ground of the castle of St. George in Elmina. Let's see. Well, I hope so, dead man. That's what I try for. I stood in front of a cell designated for incarcerated Ashanti, Mandinka, Hausa, Wolof, Hula, and Susu from various kingdoms who had been deemed as deserving of death because they fought to live in freedom. I stood there in front of the thick black wooden door hauntingly marked by a human skull and a set of crossbones carved into stone. Behind that door was a darkness I never experienced. In the 7x10 prison cell, there was a total absence of light. There was also an abject emotional darkness that came with knowing folks, wrapped in the same skin that I'm in, were left there to starve and rot in death. The captives imprisoned at the Castle of St. George were a part of what I call the carceral class. I am a member of this class. The carceral class is made up of persons of African descent who are systematically stigmatized. Let me pause there. All right, folks who are just coming in, I'm not trying to do anything to you. If you're interested in this discussion, there's a whole bunch of discussions in my in a collection down below on this channel. There's a collection of these on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in reading about it in general, I can provide you that link. But if you're going to participate in the discussion, you have to actually at least try and follow what the current discussion is, yeah? So, why do people hate rules meant to protect them? Well, that's assuming the rules are meant to protect them, and that's a really big if. And there's a lot of evidence to show that the rules are not meant to protect people. Or at least not all people. And again, if you are interested in the subject, there are a lot of videos, there's a lot of writing on this, which I invite you to dig into if you want to ask questions, you know, in a little bit more, or, you know, okay, rephrase that a bit. But while you're rephrasing, I'll continue, I suppose. Hold on. Why do people seem to generalize the police as an automatically discriminatory force, when in actuality it's more the training and some of the laws they're bound by? I'm not making judgments on individual officers. However, systemically, there are very clear incentives baked into the structure of policing and the prison system that actually create an incentive to target marginalized communities, especially Black people, but also LGBT people and indigenous populations. Even if an officer is going into it with absolutely the best intentions, they are subject to the incentives of the system. You're reading into the word abolition incorrectly. See, Reformation suggests that it's just a matter of tweaking a few things. With abolition, it's not saying we will have no law enforcement. I know that's the straw man of the abolitionist perspective, but that is not actually what the abolitionist cause is. It is instead saying to redefine how that entire structure operates, making it have more community involvement and more community accountability, making it actually serving people, and making it less focused on just being an instrument of state violence, which is currently what it is. And you can't reform that because that's structurally what it is built to be. So the abolitionist framework says this currently serves the state and is a cudgel wielded by the state. What we want for law enforcement is something whereby communities have direct say in how they are, policed, and they know the people who are policing them, and they have a more, the entire focus is more built on creating community health, and rather than just being a cudgel. So rather than just strictly putting people in cages, we're interested more in, rehabilitating people who may have a drug problem, or putting people who are homeless into a home instead of into a prison cell, for example, or, helping out the destitute. These things would drastically reduce crime a lot more than a institution of state violence can. I hope that articulates it a little better. Let's see what Shalin said. Generally, abolition refers to rebuilding police from the ground up. Yes. And in the process, we sort of get rid of the current version. Correct. Yeah. Though there are some weird people out there. Yeah. There are people who apply the systemic stuff to all cops, and I think that's just, it's more of a knee-jerk reaction. Like, I genuinely do believe that there are some cops who, quite a few, who are trying to do good in the best way that they can. It's just that the system doesn't allow them to. The only thing that the current incarnation of law enforcement allows is violence to be inflicted upon people. It doesn't really have a useful path to resolving problems. And if you are, so I do want to continue with this essay, but if you are interested in knowing more, I heavily, very, very strongly recommend digging through this series of essays. It does break things down. It is a long read. If you're not interested in reading it, like I said, I've been doing these once a week to try and convey the ideas in them. It explores things from various different perspectives. It does offer solutions. It's, it doesn't, but it is the correct word, because from the perspective of carceral, society, basically, the current incarnation of policing is an extension of chattel slavery. At the moment, we use the carceral system in the United States especially to create a a slave labor class. And there are many parts of that system which force someone into a perpetually destitute position that creates a path to criminality for them. And then they get picked up into this giant prison machine. From that perspective, it's a call to abolish slavery, because that is the perception from an abolitionist perspective. That is what the police system is. It is a continuation of slavery. And we think that there's a better option. We think there's a better path. But there's no way to reform to get to it. It has to be, the current power structure has to be gutted, and something with the correct incentives has to be put in place. There can be a transition sort of period, obviously, that would be necessary, but the current system is not working on many, many levels. So I hope that kind of explains the perspective a bit better. I know it is it can definitely make people uncomfortable to talk about. Yeah, it is abolish inequity. Exactly, Shalin. That's a very, very sharp example. You wouldn't be able to reform the monarchy into a constitutional republic. Not cleanly, anyway. Right. Exactly. So, but yeah, I'm gonna continue along here. Those were good questions, though. I do appreciate them. The carceral class is made up of persons of African descent who are systematically stigmatized as unfit for freedom and deserving of the dehumanization that comes with being incarcerated. It is essential to the idea of black people being framed as the locus of crime, and blackness as being synonymous with criminality. As the classification, the carceral class denotes that at any given time your freedom can be ripped from underneath your feet, that you can be torn away from the people you love and the places you love to be. Although he didn't name it, Malcolm X knew about the carceral class too. Now, I do want to make an aside. I know that there's a lot of criticisms about Malcolm X. However, he was very on point when it came to systemic oppression of black people in America. I've read a lot of his writings, and on those points, he knew his stuff very, very well, and he was very clear about his criticisms. He was definitely good at identifying the problem, yes. As kind of a note of analyzing history a bit, I get the impression that, especially in America, there's a tendency to want to simplify Martin Luther King as this person who was 100% for peaceful protest and never supported anyone who got riotous, which is not true, and contrast him against Malcolm X as this belligerent who just, wanted to go to war all the time, which also is not a fair characterization. The truth is they were actually a lot closer to each other than the historic lens that clouds them, this whitewashing that clouds them, suggests. They differed only slightly in methodology, and a lot of their rhetoric had huge amounts of overlap. But the full breadth of their writings doesn't really get taught or discussed. It's literature seems to take only the most palatable writings of King and present that as his complete works, completely ignoring things like his letters from Birmingham jail and some of his other criticisms that were much more harsh, and also tends to focus exclusively on the more militant writings of Malcolm X, rather than a lot more of his, especially his earlier works, when he was trying to call for, more solidarity. When he was basically oppressed for trying to call for solidarity, he's basically like, well, fine. If you don't want us, fine. We'll, give us the means to just live on our own then. Yeah. Yeah, it is a lot of difference in how they wanted to confront white people with the problem, for sure. And importantly, a lot of what we know about King and Malcolm X, at least, speaking as a white person who went through the American education system, most of it was conveyed from the white perspective rather than the perspectives of either of their actual adherents, which, is kind of a problem because, there's going to be an agenda. Anyway, that aside, I just wanted to get that out there because this writing is going to be talking a fair bit about Malcolm X, so I just wanted to get ahead of that a little bit. In Malcolm X's blistering 1963 speech, Message to the Grassroots, he spoke of the systemic condemnation of black folks in the United States. He lasered in on the uncomfortable common bond of being black in America. Malcolm made it plain and uncompromising. We are all black people, so-called Negroes, second-class citizens, ex-slaves. He said, "You are nothing but an ex-slave. You don't like to be told that, but what else are you? You are ex-slaves. You didn't come here on the Mayflower. You came here on a slave ship, in chains, like a horse or a cow or a chicken." I wrestle with what Brother Malcolm said, not because I disagree with the troublesome truths that he spoke, but because I feel his analysis can be built upon. His words still ring in my mind on a loop. You are nothing but an ex-slave. You are nothing but a slave. You are nothing. You are a thing. Malcolm's speech takes me back to the Achille Memben's on the post colony. In it, I can't pronounce these names. Membe lays bare his views on what it means to be branded, burned with the mark of being a slave. He viewed slave as the forename one must give to a man or woman whose body can be degraded, whose life can be mutilated, and whose work and resources can be squandered with impunity. I like this breakdown that he does, actually, this kind of expanding on the idea of you are nothing but an ex-slave. The last one is very poignant. The last two, actually. So, you are a thing. One of the things that we've observed a lot and talked about a lot is the objectification of black bodies. Black female bodies as like sexual objects, you know, fetishization of them. Black male bodies as basically viewed as meat that can be put into physical labor or sports for our entertainment. There's a widespread detachment and refusal to acknowledge, and I'm not saying this is everyone, obviously, but it is widespread enough that it continues to give cover for this kind of racism to exist. To view black people as kind of an other, as not equal in the human experience, as lesser. That especially gets churned out when talking about, it gets justified by people who like to say, well, you know, they must be lesser because crime, right? But as we've talked about, that doesn't hold up at all. Crime is not tied to a skin color. Crime is largely created by police to justify police budgets. Where it exists because there is lack of economic opportunity, there's lack of ability to survive, and the laws are set up to, rather than lift people up, to create that poverty and make sure that it lasts, because that is how you maintain a carceral class. There is no path to lifting up a neighborhood or a group of people in the current system. The only path is succeed under the conditions that have been inflicted on you, or go into a box where you will be used as slave labor. And the rules that are inflicted on people are fundamentally unreasonable. You know, we're seeing that with the fight for even just a modest increase in minimum wage and all kinds of things like that. The lack of health care, the lack of any sort of housing security, etc. Other countries have figured this shit out. America lags way behind because of a ideological commitment to what we call capitalism, but really is just thinly veiled white supremacy here. Yeah. Anyway, continuing on. I think about a time before enslavement, before Africans were ensnared in the wretchedness of having both their labor and their lives exploited, from can't see in the morning to can't see in the evening. They were prisoners of a particular kind. Those who were captured and eventually enslaved were regular folks, commoners, farmers, wage workers, domestic servants, and artisans who worked with their hands. 2/3 of those held captive were young African men. As Marcus Rediker recounts in The Slave Ship, A Human History, slave raiders targeted the roughest and most hardy, and avoided the privileged smooth Negroes. The class-based vulnerability of the common folks figured centrally in their capture and confinement. Rediker continues, second to war as a source of slaves were the judicial processes in and through which African societies convicted people of crimes ranging from murder to theft, adultery, witchcraft, and debt, condemned them to slavery, and sold them to African traders or directly to the slave ship captains. Many Africans and abolitionist Europeans felt that judicial processes in West Africa had been corrupted and that thousands had been falsely accused and convicted in order to produce as many tradeworthy bodies as possible. A judicial system of injustice had waged war on African commoners, criminalizing them into a world of carcerality. Malcolm's raspy tone echoes in my mind again. I hear him saying, "You didn't come here on the Mayflower. You came here on a slave ship, in chains, like a horse or a cow or a chicken." And again, Brother Malcolm was correct. We did not willingly travel to the Americas on the Mayflower. We were forced here on the White Lion and the Clotilda. It is not hyperbole to suggest that the slave ship was an aquatic prison. Its European captain was the warden, its European crew were the prison guards, and in handcuffs and leg shackles were the formerly free Africans eaten alive, buried in the belly of vessels of mass incarceration. I want to pause there again, because I recently found out about something that disturbed me even more about prisons. So obviously, one thing that we're seeing with police actually in the street and such, getting away with literal murder on the grounds of qualified immunity. And that's all kinds of problematic. It is fundamentally unjust. But one thing I did not think about, but which turns out to be true, prison guards also are protected by qualified immunity. And many prisoners have been abused and killed in prison by guards who got off because of the doctrine of qualified immunity. You don't hear about those cases as much. Prisons are good at covering them up. But I was doing some reading about that, and there's a whole laundry list of cases where this has happened. And those are the cases that actually have any sort of court documentation. Obviously, it's happening a lot more without any sort of court cases being raised about it. And that's kind of messed up. The largest wave of forced African diasporic movement was anchored to punishment and carcerality. Everywhere, the descendants of the Middle Passage were forced to find footing, carceral class status, and the struggle for liberation followed. Were forced to find footing, carceral class status, and the struggle for liberation followed. Malcolm knew the global connectedness of black folks' oppression. He knew that in the West, the African diaspora's carceral class status is still branded to our being. 40% of the 10 million incarcerated Africans brought to the Americas and sold into chattel slavery ended up in Brazil. Today, it is estimated that 75% of Brazil's prison population are Brazilians of African descent. In the country's capital, Brasilia, Afro-Brazilians make up 82% of those incarcerated, although only 11% of the country's total population is between 8 and 24 years of age. This age group represents approximately 1/3 of those imprisoned. In the United States, Black adults are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than white adults. As of 2001, 1 out of every 3 Black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, while 14% of all youth under 18 in the United States are Black. 42% of boys and 35% of girls in juvenile detention facilities are Black. Among Black trans folks, 47% have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. The criminalization of Black folks in the United States is both a pathologizing and totalizing practice. No group is spared. No group is left unvictimized. These are progeny of the commoners, prisoners of war, and freedom fighters who made up the original carceral class. Malcolm also knew that as a Muslim, there is nothing in our book, the Quran, that teaches us to suffer peacefully. On Christmas Day in 1522, 20 enslaved Muslims wielding machetes attacked their Christian masters on the island of Hispaniola. It was the first recorded enslaved African revolt in the Western Hemisphere. 4 years later, enslaved African Muslims rebelled against the Spanish on the coast of present-day South Carolina. It was the first rebellion by enslaved folks in the history of North America. In 1729, Granny Nanny, a self-liberated African Muslim leader and warrior, led her army of Maroons in Jamaica into the battle with the British and crushed them in combat. On August 14, 1791, an enslaved African Muslim named Duddy Bachman led other enslaved folks in an uprising against the French. This rebellion and the death of Bachman are marked as being one of the sparks that led to the Haitian Revolution. On the 27th night of Ramadan in January 1835, a group of enslaved African Muslims in Salvador of Bahia, Brazil, organized one of the largest slave rebellions in the history of the Americas. After being forced aboard on June 28, 1839, Sengbe Pie, an enslaved African Muslim, led the aquatic revolt on the Amistad. For members of the carceral class, resistance is in our blood. Resistance is a binding component of our collective experience. Resistance is in our history. This is the history of Black folks like Safia Bukhari, and I'm gonna butcher these, I'm so sorry. Aya Fulani, Sunni Ali, Kamal Siddiqui, Jamil Al-Amin, Mutulu Shakur, and Russell Maroon Shoatz. This is why we resist today. In the end, I returned to where I started, thinking about Saidiya Hartman's words. We live in a time created by the original mass incarceration, the transatlantic slave trade, the peculiar institution that is rooted in carcerality. Malcolm X knew this. Political prisoners in the United States today who need to be freed know this too. I too know this. There's not been a point in my life where I've not been intimately impacted by the carceral state. We know this because we have all been subject to and subjugated by the carceral state. It is this experience of knowing that informs my fight to abolish the carceral state. Okay. So that was Resistance is in Our Blood by Dr. Ameer Hasan Loggins. It's honestly really a incredible thing that there hasn't been a more substantial uprising. I suppose it may be that many people decided to see if, you know, white America would make good after our promises in the 60s at the end of the civil rights era. We haven't, is the reality of it. And if things do not change, there's all, you know, people are going to do what they have to do to survive. Okay, if that's all you're going to contribute, bye. Bye-bye, Scriblord. Engage the discussion. If, you know. So it was a very interesting and good perspective, I think. And he mentioned a number of books through this article. I always link the articles, so if you are interested in digging into those, of course, do recommend that. And as I mentioned, I'm going to see about digging up some of Dr. Loggins' writings and link them into the Discord. So we'll go ahead and transition into unstructured discussion.